Have you ever wondered just how fast Ichigo is? Or how strong his most powerful attack is? What about his spiritual pressure and what that means? Stick around and we're going to go over all of it. Within the series of Bleach, we have Soul Reapers who are responsible for balancing the souls to ensure that destruction doesn't happen to their universe. Now, let's take that and imagine their typical enemies, which are known as Hollows and Quincy's. Now, let's take these three beings, put them into a blender with a significant amount of drip and amazing music. Then you have yourself Ichigo Kurosaki. And this man is arguably one of the most powerful within Bleach. Let's start with understanding why Ichigo is the blended smoothie of all beings in Bleach, as it is very important to why Ichigo is no slouch within the Bleach or even anime world. Urahara, who is arguably the most intelligent in all of Bleach, talks about the Quincy's bringing an imbalance between the world of the living and the Soul Society. He is specifically talking about how the Quincy's would bring about the destruction to the world of the living, which is their universe. But this would also impact the Soul Society and Huacamundo. So let's go over Ichigo's biology. So Ishin, Ichigo's father, was a Soul Reaper and was originally the captain of Squad 10 before Hitsugaya was. After he found out that Soul Reapers were dying to a mysterious hollow, he went to investigate himself. Here he found a modified Arrancar that was created by Aizen that would go by the name of White. The two would fight, and then comes in Misaki. Misaki was a Quincy and was bitten by White, but Misaki was able to destroy the Arrancar. However, Hollows are considered poisonous to Quincy's, and this bite would begin to infect her. Ishin would find out about this and want to pay her back for saving him, which leads to him using his spiritual pressure to constantly combat White to keep Misaki alive. She would then pass on her Quincy blood with White's hollow energy into Ichigo as he was their first child. To ensure that everyone follows along, Ichigo has the biology and the abilities of Soul Reapers, Hollows, and Quincy's. Most of this would remain a secret to Ichigo until the start of the Bleach series. But let's continue. How about Ichigo's spiritual pressure? So after Ichigo acquires his own Soul Reaper powers, Ichigo was only able to keep his Zanpakuto in Shikai form because of how much spiritual pressure that he wields. This is considered the next form for Zanpakuto, as there's the base form, Shikai, and then Bankai. Unohana, captain of Squad 4 and the original Kenpachi, believes Ichigo to be at captain level spiritual pressure even when he was at half of his full spiritual pressure, along with the fact that this was before the training he went through in the Dangai, the Quincy abilities, and his true Zanpakuto that he would later unlock. To follow up with this, we know that Ichigo naturally has insanely high spiritual pressure, and then after he learns how to utilize his hollow form, he is able to combat the likes of Grimmjow, who historically defeated Ichigo several times and was the number 6 Arrancar or Espada. Then later we have Aizen, who is the main antagonist up to this point, and we learn that the Espada didn't follow Aizen because of his terrifying Zanpakuto ability to have total hypnosis. It was his overwhelming spiritual pressure, and Ichigo was one of the few that would be able to contest Aizen in this category at this point. Well then, after Ichigo performs his training in the Dangai, he is able to pass Aizen in power so much that Aizen is unable to sense his power, which is mentioned several times in the series as a way to express just how big of a delta in power there is between two different individuals. If you want to think of it in terms of a bar graph, I like to think of it as the more powerful individual is so much higher in spiritual pressure that the weaker couldn't even see the top of the other's bar. But this gap has to be unbelievable, because with how powerful Aizen was, could still be sensed until he started to transcend what a Soul Reaper could do. Then Ichigo is able to do the very same thing with Aizen himself, where he mistakes Ichigo's power as he transferred all his spiritual pressure with his physical strength. Aizen himself goes on to say that he can't believe the difference on their power and believes Ichigo to be an entire dimension higher than Aizen, as he can't perceive Ichigo's power. This is also before Ichigo goes into his Moigetsu form that he uses for the final Getsuga Tensho. This same Ichigo would go on to face Yhwach, the king of the Quincy's, and at the time loses. But one of the things that we got to keep in mind is that Ichigo hasn't understood that he is part Quincy, which is holding back his true potential. The Yhwach that Ichigo fights is originally able to defeat Yamamoto, who is the general captain, and Ichibei, who is the primordial being that is noted to be the single most powerful Soul Reaper ever. When Ichigo discovers himself and unleashes his new Zanpakuto, he is able to have the single largest leap in power in the series right here. But more on Ichigo's fights in a moment. Let's talk about Ichigo's rate of growth and his experience considering how young he is to how powerful he gets. Very early on in the series, Ichigo finds out that Ishida is a Quincy and finds himself in a situation where he needs to fight waves of hollows to defend Karakura Town. And then we see Menos Grandes. Rukia notes that these are thousands of hollows put together, and at 15 years old with no training, Ichigo is not only able to stop the Menos from entering the town, he blocks a Cetero blast from the hollow and is able to fight through it. Under the teaching of Urahara and Yoriichi, Ichigo acquires his Bankai in 3 days. This takes Soul Reapers decades or even centuries to go from becoming a Soul Reaper to the final level of a Bankai. Then to add, just because you have a Bankai doesn't mean that you are automatically even with the most experienced captains. With how Captain Itsugaya was considered a prodigy for his age, when Shinsuke is fighting with Stark, who was the #1 Espada, the two are talking about who is more powerful between the two captains. To which Shinsuke shares that Hitsugaya is no doubt going to pass him in the next century, but Shinsuke was the more powerful of the two at the time. Then everything that Ichigo does takes place within Bleach in about 5 years. So when Ichigo first unlocks his Soul Reaper powers, he meets Zangetsu, who is in the form of a young Yhwach, where they try to share their name to Ichigo, but this doesn't happen because Ichigo hasn't built a relationship with Zangetsu to know the name of his sword, which is typically a big way that Soul Reapers are able to unlock new heights in power. Unless your name is Kenpachi, who is the only captain in history to become a captain without a Bankai, and throughout most of the series does not know the name of his sword, which is the first step in unlocking power from your Zanpakuto. Another thing that I have seen being overlooked with Ichigo is that everyone he has fought has been actively training for decades again, or even centuries. To add on to this, most of Ichigo's enemies wielded a sword and were no slouches when it came to their swordsmanship. I mean, they are literally able to talk to their Zanpakuto. If I see folks claiming that Ichigo is not a master swordsman, or a swordsman in general, I may have to cry a little. Anyways, I would like to note that Ichigo, right after he revealed his Bankai, was able to deflect all of Byakuya's Bankai blades, which Byakuya describes himself as millions of different blades. Also, he did this one-handed and was not damaged. Keep in mind, this was a very young Ichigo in comparison to the entire series. Speaking of Ichigo's Bankai, let's go over it. His original Bankai transforms his Zanpakuto to a small sword, but he inherits all of its power into his strength and speed. When we are originally learning about the amplifier of power with a Bankai, we learn that it can range from 5 to 10 times for the Soul Reaper. Obviously, this can vary with the Soul Reaper themselves, their experience with their Zanpakuto, their spiritual pressure, and the abilities of the Bankai itself. In his true Bankai form, this follows the same suit, and more as Ichigo has no more closed gates withholding his power, and can show the full combined might of his Soul Reaper, Hollow, Fullbringer, and Quincy powers. We don't get to see this too much because it is revealed right at the end of the series, and we don't get much of an explanation other than the assumption that with Ichigo learning about his past, gathering his complete Zanpakuto, and an elevated Hollow form, that he is just that much stronger than before. But with all the abilities that Soul Reapers, Hollows, and Quincy's are able to do, here are the abilities that we see Ichigo use. Ichigo is able to use Flash Step or Shunpo. This is a Soul Reaper tactic that lets the user move incredibly fast. When Ichigo loses against Ulquiorra, who is a 4th ranked Espada, and turns into a Vassalorde, we see him perform a Cero, which completely overwhelmed Ulquiorra, who was in his 2nd release form, and Instant Regeneration, where he was able to completely heal before before he obliterated Ulquiorra. Another hollow ability Ichigo has is Sonido. This is another movement technique, except this one completely distorts your spiritual pressure, meaning that it can be scarier than a flash step since you cannot be sensed for a short amount of time. This happens when Ichigo arrives at the Soul Society at the beginning of the first Quincy invasion, and the Quincy's are confused about what just happened when Ichigo performs the Sonido himself. Having Quincy blood running through his veins, this allows Ichigo to directly counter some of the Sternritter with the insane abilities that they have. One example is the first Sternritter we meet that is capable of jailing anyone. Yhwach himself states that no one should have been able to escape the jail they created around Ichigo when he was traveling in between Huacamundo and Soul Society. But with these abilities, how fast is Ichigo? In the Soul Society arc, when the Hollows are saving Aizen and friends, we see them protect them with a light ability. The negation ability that the Menos Grande are able to use is light that allows them to save their allies. We learned later that Aizen had constructed Kaha Negation and provided it to the Espada for them to use against their subordinates if they acted out. We see this when Grimmjow uses it against Ulquiorra to separate the 4th ranked Espada so that Grimmjow would be able to fight Ichigo in peace. This specific box is noted to seal away its victim inside a closed dimension forever. I know that we're getting into how fast Ichigo is, but this is also relevant to the power that he possesses later, so don't forget this part. So with the countless Menos Grande that arrived to Aizen's rescue at the end of the Rukia retrieval arc, or the Soul Society arc, we know that this is a light-based ability that was able to be reacted to by several different folks, including Yoruichi and Soifan, who had tried to pin down Aizen, Hisagi Shuhei, who was near Tozen, and Rengeku, who was near Gin. 2 of these are the fastest characters we have seen at this point, but the other 2 are assistant captains who, yes, could know flash step or just be fast enough to dodge the light from the Menos Grande. Point here is that Hisagi and Rengeku wouldn't be as fast as Ichigo with his Bankai at this point, as we saw him overwhelm Byakuya in this fight after he showed off his Bankai. So the argument can be made that none of these characters did a flash step to avoid the beam of light from the Hollows, when we know that flash step is what Yoruichi, Soifan, and Byakuya at this point talk about when trying to catch each other in their interactions, where we should be under the belief that this allows them to travel at their fastest. But for the sake of argument, let's assume they use flash step to avoid these beams of light. Then let's just say Ichigo at this point has light speed feats. Now, I am going to fast track here a bit, but it is important to the growth that Ichigo is able to do with his speed from this point, and to the point where he is going from the top of the Royal Palace and into the Soul Society. We hear from arguably the fastest Soul Reaper we have ever heard of, Tenjiro from the Zero Squad, the same guy that was able to completely outpace Soifan when he was directly in front of her. He shared with Ichigo that traveling at normal flash step speed would take a week straight for him to reach the Soul Society. So let's just figure out how far away these 2 areas are. With light traveling at 186,282.4 miles per second, then with the note of having to perform a normal flash step for a week straight, which is 604,800 seconds non-stop, that someone that knows flash step has to travel. This means that it is 112,663,595,520 miles away from the Soul Society, and Ichigo is capable of traveling 14 times the speed in his base form that isn't amplified by his true Zanpakuto or Horn of Salvation hollow form, with the assumption that everyone that dodged the Menos Negation light ability that they all used flash step and not just their base movement. Then take this to 14 times at a casual pace for Ichigo, but wait! Things get even more nutty. So we have Ukitake, who has a portion of the Soul King's power, and that power is able to reach the Royal Palace at an unbelievable rate. And after Yhwach had his dialogue with Mimihagi, he absorbed the power from Ukitake and used it for himself. But what we are focusing on here is how quickly it reached the Royal Palace from the Soul Society. So with how fast everything takes place here, and Yhwach decides to absorb the power and pull it out of Ukitake, we should be able to say that it's about 5 seconds for him to get the last of the power and absorb it, which Yhwach is able to use in his battle with Ichigo and it's literally in the same form as when he left Ukitake. Then in his fight with Ichigo, this power would be dodged by Ichigo. So how fast is Yhwach's attack using the Soul King's power? So let's go over this real quick. So essentially this boils down to it's going to be 120,960 times faster than light or flash step. Then to add to this, Ichigo performs these dodges in his Shikai form, and we all know that Ichigo's Bankai straight up increases his strength and speed. So to go back to the statement, when we learn about Bankais and how it empowers a user, we can lowball at 5 times more speed and attack, or highball his true Bankai to 10 times what we went over. Dodging Yhwach's attack using the Soul King's power from Mimihagi is a feat that puts Ichigo in the 13 quadrillion miles per second range. And our solar system from end to end is 30 trillion miles across, meaning that Ichigo would be able to travel across our solar system in base form 454 times in 1 second. Then in Bankai, add a 5-time multiplier, his physical power increases. This would be 68 quadrillion. Then at 10 times his physical power increase, this would be 136 trillion miles per second. Without hollow form buff, this means that Ichigo can travel our entire solar system from end to end 4,500 times in 1 second. Now, don't get me wrong, Ichigo does get hit with the attack after Yhwach turns it after the initial dodge. But I mean, come on, we're displaying the fastest thing in the series by the guy that can change it mid-attack and see the future. Let's give credit where it's due. So what defenses does Ichigo have? Outside of the base spiritual pressure that we have gone over, which is incredibly relevant to this topic because we learned from Kenpachi that you cannot pierce someone if there is too much of a difference in spiritual pressure between two individuals. So there are going to be very few that can actually harm Ichigo in general because of this. But for the few that are able to pass this, Ichigo has his hollow powers, which includes his mask. On top of the huge buff in power it provides, the mask itself is incredibly durable and would only continue to become more durable as Ichigo becomes more powerful. We first see this when Ichigo is fighting in the Soul Society and survives a strike that would normally have killed him, but the mask had a large crack in it, meaning that it had absorbed most of the impact. Then Ichigo would later control his hollow powers and would be able to defeat Espada number 6, Grimmjow, in his Resurrection form. Another defense that Ichigo obtains is what the Quincy's have, which is called Blood Vena. When Ichigo first uses this ability, it saves him from his first encounter with Yhwach. He would then learn about his Quincy heritage and master this ability. But how powerful are the beings in Bleach? Maybe Ichigo's just too strong and it's not that big a deal in the comparison of Bleach. Maybe he's not so strong. So now that we know how fast Ichigo is on a very low ball, let's get into just how powerful characters within Bleach are within their feats, because I see a lot of confusion on how powerful the strongest characters are. And what I'm going to share is some of the weakest characters with what they have been able to do, which is pretty insane. So we're going to go back to the Menos Grandes. These beings are made up of thousands of hollows, which are the souls that will eventually find themselves within Huecamundo. When we first meet these hollows, we see them appear in the world of the living. For the Menos Grandes to make their appearance, we see them literally tear a hole in the sky from Huecamundo and into the world of the living. In case you were not aware, the Bleach cosmology is separated into several different dimensions that are so separate that the only way to travel another of these dimensions is to travel through the Dongai. To travel through the Dongai, these need to be either constructed or literally torn through the different dimensions. We do know that the world of the living is just like our own universe in that it is an infinite universe. Then between the different dimensions of the Soul Society, Huecamundo, and the world of the living, there is a need to balance the souls between them, otherwise all of this will fall apart. Now that we know the size of Bleach's cosmology and how cumbersome it is to travel between these dimensions, let's continue on to the feats that we have seen to help explain Ichigo's unbelievable power. Following what we went over with the Menos Grande and how they are able to travel through the Donkai and tear away through the world of the living, we do see other things like this happen even more. This exact exact thing happens when they rescue Aizen, Gin, and Tozen from the Soul Society, and then another time when the Grand Fisher arrives for the last time in the series. After Grand Fisher, the hollow that killed Ichigo's mother, receives an upgrade in power to become an Arrancar. They tear through the world of the living as well. They are effortlessly defeated by Isshin, Ichigo's father. Then, to take it another step further, in the Arrancar arc, we have Grimmjow fighting with Ulquiorra, the number 4 Espada. We know that Grimmjow doesn't have a chance to actually defeat Ulquiorra here, but Grimmjow uses what we went over before to send Ulquiorra into another dimension that keeps Ulquiorra busy enough, as he is gone during the entirety of Ichigo and Grimmjow's fight, a scuffle with Ichigo and Neutra, and Yami as well. Ulquiorra then returns after this, where I am of the opinion that was created by Aizen himself, has to have some sort of complexity to it for Ulquiorra to take that long. Granted, yeah, he was in base form, and I'm not saying it needs to be a dimensional level higher, but there has to be something special about this dimension where the 4th ranked Espada is having trouble going through this, and it was expected to keep an Arrancar in there indefinitely, and Arrancars are much higher in power than a basic Menos. The last example of this is when Kenpachi and Gremmy are fighting. Gremmy's ability is imagination, and in their fight, Gremmy opens a pocket to outer space to go around Kenpachi's durability and make him face the vacuum of space. When this happens, Kenpachi swipes through Gremmy, and we see he is able to hold open the pocket of space that Gremmy was trying to send Kenpachi through. Since Kenpachi is able to do this with one hand and is able to still fight back, we should believe that something like this is pretty casual for these more powerful beings within Bleach. Now that we have an idea of how strong some of the different folks are, let's get into who Ichigo himself has fought and what exactly that means. One of the earliest fights we see that shows Ichigo has come a long way is when he fights Renji in Karakura Town. Keep in mind, Renji is at 20% of his power, but we also get to keep in mind Renji is an assistant captain to Byakuya Kuchiki, meaning he is only one seat beneath a captain. So when Ichigo and Renji fight, Ichigo gets the upper hand, and then we get to see the delta in power from an assistant captain to a captain. When Byakuya defeats a very young Ichigo, who hadn't even unlocked his own Soul Reaper powers yet. Then Ichigo would go through arguably the largest gauntlet of fights most have ever seen. And this is within the Soul Society, where no one is going to be nerfed like Renji and Byakuya were originally. Then Ichigo would go on to face off against Renji again, who would lose to Ichigo at this point. Then after a small healing, Ichigo would face off against Kenpachi, the captain of Squad 11. First, the fight shows us that there's a significant delta in spiritual pressure between two opponents. Then the much stronger opponent will not be scratched by the inferior one. Then after Ichigo begins to work with Zangetsu, the two are able to work together to defeat Kenpachi. After this, Ichigo does get overzealous and thinks he can take on Byakuya in his condition and is knocked out by Yoriichi. This allows him to learn Bankai, which is, as we know, a huge leap in Soul Reaper powers. Next up is when Ichigo is learning from the Vizards how to control his inner hollow. He is pushed over the edge by Hiyori, who used to be an assistant captain within the Soul Society, and is able to unleash her hollow form on Ichigo. During their training, Ichigo is able to completely overwhelm her, which forces the entire Vizard squad to pin down Ichigo in his hollowed state to save her life. A foreshadow into what power Ichigo is capable of. Next up, we have Ichigo facing off against Dordani Alessandro del Soccaccio, who was more powerful than Bankai Ichigo, and force Ichigo to use his hollowified Getsuga Tensho to one-shot the fallen Espada. This is important to note because at the point, Ichigo is still very weak in comparison to the end of the series, and this Ichigo is far above all Arrancars outside most of the Espada, that he is in that tier of power that can rip through reality like the weakest of Menos. Grimmjow is a bit further in the story, and in a 1v1, he is able to defeat the number 6 Espada. Here we see that Ichigo is able to maintain his hollow form much longer than he has before. But Ulquiorra is where things take a turn, as Ulquiorra is technically ranked number 4 when it comes to power and is the only Espada that has a second Resurrection form. I plan to do a detailed video on him in the future with a recent poll that we had, but essentially here Ichigo is outclassed. After Ichigo is swiftly defeated, he transforms into a Vasto Lore form of himself and has no idea he is doing this. But while yes, Ichigo does get the victory here, it does express how much power the hollow side of Ichigo does possess, considering he did go from being utterly defeated to literally flipping the roles on who was the more powerful between the two. Moving on to Ichigo versus Aizen, we know that Ichigo has never seen Aizen release his Zanpakuto in front of Ichigo before, and is the last hope for everyone on defeating him. But we see that Ichigo's power at this point isn't enough to take out Aizen. But at this point, Ichigo is able to work with his dad, Ishin, where Ichigo learns about the final Getsuga Tensho. Then, being within the Dongai, there is a difference in time that takes place compared to the world of the living. This allows Ichigo to train for 1 month and get the single largest jump in power that we have seen in the series up to this point. Once Ichigo confronts Aizen, he is able to grab Aizen by the face to throw him across the field for them to have their final fight. Along with this, Aizen claims that he is unable to sense Ichigo's spiritual pressure and mistakes Ichigo's transformation to include him transferring his spiritual pressure into his physical strength, like his Bankai. But Aizen would find out that even casting a fully fledged Hado in the 90s, that this would be nothing but an arm swipe for Ichigo at this point to break through it. The only reason that Ichigo actually uses the final Getsuga Tensho is because Aizen keeps adapting with the Goku and wants to end it. Then we fast forward to the last arc with the 1,000-year Blood War, and we have the single strongest being that isn't technically a god, Yhwach. This new bad Quincy comes in and hacks General Captain Yamamoto with one slice and is able to empower the Stern Ritter that would destroy a good portion of the Soul Society on their first attack. Yhwach himself takes on Ichibe, who is the most powerful Soul Reaper in history, to the point that he is able to kill Ichibe and go on to the Soul King. So knowing just how out of everyone's league that Yhwach himself is, this will help show where Ichigo lands. So, Yhwach has a list of individuals that he deems as special threats that are capable of stopping him from being successful in his plans, and Ichigo is the main special threat to Yhwach. This is in comparison to everyone, specifically Aizen, Urahara, Kenpachi, and Ichibe as well. This is something that Yhwach makes very clear throughout the arc. And after Ichigo displays his true Bankai form with the Horn of Salvation, Yhwach does quick work to not make it a possibility for Ichigo to use this ridiculous power. And Yhwach uses his Almighty to destroy it in the future, where we see it fall apart right after. But after Ichigo is able to repair his Bankai, Yhwach is faced off with Ichigo again, except this time Yhwach isn't able to change the future, and after having his Almighty disabled for only seconds, Ichigo is able to hit him with everything he has and defeat him in one slice of his Bankai, which didn't even include his hollow buff being repaired at the time. Then to add, within the light novels, specifically the Can't Fear Your Own World, we hear that the Soul King was killed. Then Shinsuke, the general captain of the 13 court guard squads, and Ichibe, the head captain of Zero Squad, were in agreement that Ichigo would have been their worst case scenario backup plan to maintain the separation of the world of the living, Soul Society, and Huacamundo, meaning that Ichigo's power is so rare that the likes of the entire Soul Society wouldn't have an acceptable replacement after Ukitake was killed. Then we also hear that when anyone from the Royal Guard unleashes their Bankai, that it will shake all of the dimensions. And by the end of the series, Ichigo has more destructive power than all of them. So how strong is Ichigo's strongest attack? Without a doubt, the strongest attack we have seen is the Getsuga Tensho with the Grand Zero when Ichigo is in his true Bankai and Horn of Salvation form. But just how powerful is that? With everything that we have over on Amenos breaking the literal sky, all the way to Kenpachi holding down the sky from collapsing with his bare hands, we are likely looking at Ichigo at least being capable of universal damage. The tricky part is that when we see him use this attack on Yhwach, who has the best durability feat of withstanding blows from Ichibe, who is the most powerful Soul Reaper in history, and Yhwach at 50% strength withstands the primordial being that is Ichibe, we have got to give it to him. Let me know what you think of the video and be sure to subscribe for more. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.